All right. Hey, confirmation students, how are you? It's Pastor Brian. Happy Wednesday. So today is February 24th, and it is a beautiful day again today. The sun is shining. Thanks be to God. Yesterday we had the warmest day we've had in 6 weeks. It got into the 40s, which is awesome. Looking ahead to the forecast this weekend, it's going to be maybe 50 degrees. Won't that be awesome? I love weather warming up. And here's why I started talking about that. That's all about science. And science is such an interesting topic. And we're actually going to talk about that over these next few weeks in confirmation. And you might be thinking, why are we talking about science, which is something I talk about in school, in confirmation class? I thought science was like a school thing, but confirmation was like a God thing. Maybe you thought that. In fact, for a lot of people, merely talking about science and God can be controversial. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today and really in the coming weeks. But first, let me ask you a question. How do you feel about science class? Are you in the camp of people that, you love science class? Like, it's one of your favorite classes. You love discovering things and learning how things work. Or maybe you're in that camp, you're like, science, not really my thing. I was probably a little more in the liking science class. That's because in science, we got to do stuff, play with stuff. I remember labs in science class in high school and getting to play with stuff, and I felt like an adult because I got all this cool stuff I got to do in science class when I was your age and a little bit older. So here's why we're talking about science in confirmation class. You're in science class at school, and I'm guessing you might be hearing talk about things like evolution and the Big Bang Theory, and all these different ways to think about how God made the world that don't read from Genesis chapter 1. So you're hearing these things in science class about how everything came to be, but then you kind of come to church and you hear something different. And science class doesn't talk a lot about God, and the God class, church and confirmation, don't talk a lot about science. And so it might feel to you like God and science are on opposing teams. Like you're either on the science team or the God team. And it feels like the God team must not like the science team because the God team doesn't talk a lot about science. And the science team must really not like God because the science team never really talks a lot about God. Maybe you're confused about that. Maybe you haven't really thought about that yet, but you might coming up at some point. And that'll be really interesting because you have to think through all those things. But here's my statement that I want to make today. Even though it feels like the God team and the science team are pitted against each other, like the Bears versus the Packers or the Cubs versus the White Sox, but what if it was never supposed to be like that? What if it was never supposed to be like God and science were on different opposing teams clashing with each other, but instead they were supposed to, in essence, work together? You see, that's the way it's supposed to be because, in essence, science is meant to lead us to a better understanding of God. Science questions and all you learn about in science class, those are good questions to ask because they're asking questions like, how did we get here? And how does this all work? And I believe that those questions lead us to God. Now, here's why I, Pastor Brian, in 2021 can say that. Because the truth is, Team Science and Team God weren't always against each other. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the best scientists in the world were Christians. In the 1400s, there was a man named Copernicus. Copernicus gives us tons of knowledge in the 1400s about the planets and the skies and the stars. Guess what? Copernicus was a Christian. In the 1500s, a guy by the name of Galileo, he's considered the father of science. Guess what? He's a Christian. In the 1600s, into the 1700s, a man by the name of Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists the world has ever known. Guess what? He's a Christian. The 1700s, a man by the name of Michael Faraday, he gives us tons of knowledge about electricity and electromagnetism. Guess what he was? A Christian. 1800s into the 1900s, a man by the name of William Kelvin teaches us a lot about heat and temperature. William Kelvin was a Christian. Bottom line, all these folks, they knew who God was. They knew who God was, and they saw science as a way to explain how God made everything. Were they on opposing teams fighting against each other? No. They were on the same team. They said, hey, this all works together. God made it. He's the who. And how he made it, we get to discover in science. So their question was really, how did God make everything? They didn't see God and science as opposing. They saw God and science, in essence, is working together. That when you dive into science questions, you get to know more about who God actually is. So then, if all these Christians, Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, William Kelvin, if these were all Christians and they were scientists, what happened? Why does it seem like now there's this war against God and science? Well, let's talk a little bit about that briefly. There's the who, that's God, and the how, that's science. How did God make everything? So over time, it started with, okay, we believe in the who, God. We just want to discover with our brains the how. Over time, the how kind of became more important and kind of pushed out the who. Instead of starting with who God was and saying, how did God make all this awesome stuff? They started looking first at all the awesome stuff, and kind of over time they pushed God out of the conversation. And then it was all about science. It was all about how everything made, and God kind of got pushed to the side. Maybe you've had an experience in your life where something else became really important in your life for a short period of time, and God kind of got pushed out. That's almost exactly what happens with science over the last few decades and centuries. God got pushed out. So here's what I want to do with you briefly today. I want to kind of invite God back into the equation. Just like all those well-known scientists were Christians, as you go to science class, you can enter it with a Christian perspective. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It tells us that important answer. Who? It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Later on in John's Gospel, it says, nothing that has been made by someone other than God. God is the who. But then we think, well, there's not a lot about how. I want more science in the Bible. The cool thing is God gave you a brain. That's part of his gift to you. That you could use your brain that he gave you to discover, now that you know the who, science is the how. How did God, the who, the first mover, make everything and make everything work together so perfectly? And then I'm convinced then that science class and all the things you're going to learn about in science are actually going to lead you back to the God who created you. Because, like me, you're going to marvel at, holy cow, this is incredibly amazing. God gave us brains to discover and prove and scientifically study amazing things. Did you know, for example, that the Earth is the perfect distance and perfectly tilted away from the sun so that there can be life here on Earth? That's an amazing discovery that points to God made it that way to me. Do you know that just to have life on Earth, there has to be the perfect balance of hydrogen and oxygen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere so that human beings and really all of life can live and move and breathe and have its being. That's that perfect symmetry between the oxygen and everything in the air and all the living creatures that walk on the earth. That to me points to God. God created everything. Do you know how even something as simple as the human eye or the human ear works? That to me points to God. Do you know there's things in our body called nerves that enable us to feel and sense things? You know that if you stretched out all the nerves in the human body, it would stretch for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And it's all within you and me. Friends, I don't know about you, but that points me back to God. That's the how of how everything is wired. And we're still learning tons about science. But underneath it all is the who. God who made everything. So we're going to talk about this in the next few weeks in confirmation class, and I'm loving that we're talking about it. Because at the end of the day, who, God, and how, science, they're not meant to be opposing and battling against one another. We're on the same team. Science just shows us how, the who, God made everything. So hey, you probably got science class this week. As you're there, I want you to almost think in the back of your mind, this isn't fighting against God. This is pointing me to God and His power. All right, you've got a Google form to fill out, some great questions to reflect on. I wish you a great rest of your week. Hope you get outside and get some of that fresh air that God made for you. Have a great day.